is the historical genealogy of the Jewish people. Now, if you don't study history too much, this might shock you, actually, because historians have a very different view of where Israel came from than in the Bible. The Bible talks about the Exodus story. It talks about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how they had a huge conquest of Canaan under the general Joshua. But history is very divided on even if there was an Exodus in Israel. Some historians say there was evidence of an enslaved group of Semites. I know I haven't defined that yet, but for our purposes here, we're going to define them as Israelites. Just for our purposes for right now, we're going to get to the definition later, but for now, we're just to simplify it. Now, having gotten that out of the way, there's some evidence that a group of them were in Egypt. They were working under Pharaoh Ramses II. He was initiating massive building projects. And the thing is, though, even if they were in Egypt at this time, they don't have any archaeological evidence, or if so, very little, that an Exodus happened. The other theory is far more interesting, and I've learned this primarily through some reading of my own and also from an open course from Yale University, which you can find actually on YouTube. It's extremely, extremely fascinating. What's her last name? Christina Hayes. That's the professor there at Yale who teaches the course. And through, what I've learned and what is a major theory among historians is that the Israelites probably were Canaanites. Now, if you're a purely Judeo-Christian person, that's like, heresy! You're calling the Israelites Canaanites? The enemies of Israel who they are not allowed to mingle with? Well, historians are like, well, they were in the land of Canaan. The Bible even says in one point in Exodus chapter 6 that the patriarchs worshiped the god El, which is the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon they found in the library of Ur-Gerit. I don't think I said that right, but El was the first name for God for the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that was the head god of the Canaanite pantheon. And so that's where historians kind of come to a conclusion that rather than having an exodus, the Israelites are kind of like a splinter group of the Canaanite religion. They find that at around the time of when the Exodus would happen, the development of Israel, 1300 BCE, 1200 BCE, there was a major shift in the Canaanite pantheon, where actually the head god, El, which is actually the image of the old white guy with the beard and up there, that's where that comes from. He was replaced with Baal, which, if you know the Bible, is a god that is like one of the chief enemies of Israel, the worship of Baal. Very heretical. And there was a splinter group who worshipped the god Yahweh, who was at this time he was kind of like a war storm raider god in the pantheon, the Canaanite texts say. And there's connections to how, this storm god and raider god would go to a place called Sinai, and there's geographical evidence that this splinter group was near Sinai, or the Bible also calls it Horeb. They're the same thing. There's a lot of nuances, but the point is that there's a totally different thing than what you traditionally hear. But what we do know for sure is that at around 1200 BCE, and I gave a Sunday sermon about this at our local church 2 weeks ago, and I mentioned this point, which was that at this time, the ancient Near East, this region of the world, had a sudden shift, huge change, because these ancient, what historians call sea people, which they theorize may have just come from Northern Europe because of climate change, typically is a cause historians cite for migration of peoples. They cite that as a possible cause for the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, for example. But nonetheless, around this time, they invaded, and it was a ferocious invasion. There's so many writings from various kings, such as the Babylonians and the Egyptians, like, who are these people? We don't know what to do. They have weaponry that is making our weapons inoperable. We don't know what to do. And so Egypt was weakened, Babylon was weakened, the Hittite Empire was completely wiped out, the Canaanite city-states, or all these groups of Canaanites, the city-states were gone. And then from the ashes, there's a king named Saul in 1080 BCE, and there's the state of Israel, which is on the left of your screen, along with other Canaanite tribes and city-states. So that's the fact that from history that we know, that no matter how it happened, no matter what theory you propose, at around 1080 BCE, Israel emerged. There was a group of Israel, they worshipped the god Yahweh, and the Israelite religion. Saul, yes. King Saul was the first king of Israel. That's how historians kind of determine the founding of Israel. They see the first emergence of the Israeli state with King Saul, which they have historical evidence for. From the time of King Saul in 1080 BCE, there's a lot more historical evidence of the Israelites. And the Bible is far more accurate after that time. But beforehand, historians are kind of very, very skeptical because there's not much actual physical evidence. But long story short, how can I summarize 1,000 years of Israel's history in 30 seconds? They were one nation, then they were two. One half got wiped out, the other was captured. And then that captured nation finally reclaimed the city of Jerusalem, but then kept getting invaded and under the occupancy of various empires. And then, lastly, by the Roman Empire. And then you know the story of the emergence of Jesus Christ, who was responsible for the emergence of Christianity, one of the world's biggest and most prominent religions, alongside Islam, by the way. And basically, because of this is not the point of the presentation, so I'm not going to go into why this Jewish diaspora happened, because we don't have time for that. But the Jewish diaspora occurred in 70 CE, right after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, Israel's capital city, or at that time it was called Judea. And they spread all over the world, including into Arabia. Now, pause. That is historical summary of the origins of the Israelites, the most detailed part of which I've detailed here. Okay, it's not. It doesn't like how fast I'm clicking. I'm trying to go quick. Thousands of years of history in 40 minutes, guys. Computer doesn't like me. This is Arabia. This is a map from when Babylon was probably at one of its heights in its power. But no matter what, there was this Arabian desert. And you had these wandering tribes. First coined in 853 BCE. Historians don't know that much about the origin of the Arabs because they were so nomadic. They were so... they did not have much territory. There's a whole chapter by this historian named Tim McIntosh where what he talks about is not like, oh, they had this empire and this ruler. He talks about camels and the importance of camels for these people, which they were super important, by the way. I skimmed many parts of that chapter, even though it wasn't relevant to this presentation. But he was saying, that's like the biggest takeaway for historians. One of the biggest takeaways for them, for the first, in the BCEs of history, for the Arabs, is the camels, the wandering. But you still had some separation. There are still some known civilizations of these tribes that were in the Arabian area. You could separate them into the north and the south, as Tim McIntosh, historian of this area, likes to put it. He separates them, the north as being way more nomadic than the south. There's the Nabateans in the 3rd century. They're one case of a famous Arab power in the BCEs. But you don't hear much about them until the 6th century CE, where Mecca becomes this huge hub of religion, culture, trade, and commerce. If you know the Black Stone or the Cube, there's several names for it, is a extremely historical site in the Islamic religion. Mecca is where you go to complete your pilgrimage, which is one of the 5 core articles of faith in Islam. Now, shifting to the south, they were less wandery, they had a bit more territory. Some historians call them tribal confederations. You had the Sabaean civilization, which is notable because the Sabaeans were a group of Arabs that worshipped the sun, and there's a verse in the Quran which it seems to imply that the Sabaean worship of the sun was them worshiping Allah, which is the name of God in Islam. But as they didn't come. They came into contact with major powers, but they were so insignificant to these powers that, for example, the Assyrians, they just thought they were a bit of an annoyance, and they didn't do much to disrupt the borders of these major empires, and that's one reason why there's kind of not as much record of them as Israel, where you have documentation of the Persians, Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Roman Empire all having significant contact. And of course, you have Jesus Christ. I mean, maybe that puts Israel on the map a bit. But we know that at some point, these southern groups of Arabs lost prominence because they were invaded by the Ethiopians, and there was some Christianity introduced into the region. Were you expecting more about the Arabs, guys? Sure. So north would be here. And so the northern tribes had more contact with major powers. At this time, Babylon controlled this region. At other times it was the Greeks. Other times it was the Romans, other territories. So that's why the Assyrians called them Arabs, because they were just these wandering nomads. The south is more down here, as you get closer to, I believe, modern Yemen, I believe. I'm not too caught up with my modern geography. But that's where you get the southern tribes. So the northern tribes had more contact with these empires, but even then they did not, they weren't a threat to these major empires. So the empires, they negotiated to use trade routes at various times, and these northern tribes, they did make some, they had some benefit off of it, but not much more than that.